The story begins with Franklin Lewis, a successful and discreet billionaire, reflecting on his decision to investigate a struggling corporation before deciding to invest. Disguised as a junior consultant, he enters the company to assess the situation firsthand. From the outset, Franklin experiences the condescending behavior of the directors, who dismiss his suggestions and treat him as irrelevant. He starts noticing some discrepancies in the company's finances, sparking his suspicion that something deeper is going on. Franklin Lewis adjusted his tie, glancing at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He barely recognized himself in the off-the-rack suit and generic glasses. It was a far cry from his usual bespoke attire and designer eyewear. For this mission, however, every detail mattered. He needed to blend in, not stand out. To everyone else at Ellis & Company, he was just Sam, an entry-level consultant, another face in the sea of cubicles. He took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself. The days of being underestimated were already wearing on him, but he reminded himself that the bigger picture required patience. The fate of hundreds of employees rested on his ability to endure the condescension and arrogance of the company's leadership, at least for a little while longer. As he walked into the office, he was immediately greeted by the cold, sterile atmosphere. It was only his second week at Ellis & Company, but the oppressive feeling of dread among the employees was palpable. He knew the company was struggling, but the morale here was beyond low. It was suffocating. "Hey, Sam, got another brilliant idea for us today?" The mocking voice belonged to Jason, one of the senior analysts. He was lounging against a desk, a smug grin plastered on his face as he looked Franklin up and down. Franklin forced a polite smile. "Just here to learn and contribute where I can." Jason laughed, shaking his head. "You're too eager, man. They don't pay us enough to care that much. But hey, good luck with that." Franklin nodded and moved past him, heading toward his cubicle. As he sat down, he couldn't help but overhear the conversation between Jason and another analyst. "Can you believe that kid actually tried to pitch a cost-saving strategy to Richard yesterday?" Jason snickered. "Oh, I heard about that." Richard practically laughed him out of the room. The other analyst replied, "Yeah, some junior consultant thinks he can come in here and tell us how to run things." Unreal. Franklin's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. It was all part of the plan. If he revealed his true identity now, he would lose the chance to see the company's true colors. He needed to understand exactly what was going wrong here, and more importantly, who was responsible. Later that day, Franklin received a meeting invitation. It was from Richard. Mandatory strategy session. The subject line read. He felt a surge of anticipation. This was his chance to gather more intel. But when he arrived at the conference room, the sight that greeted him was anything but welcoming. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other directors. They all looked at Franklin as he entered, their expressions ranging from amusement to outright disdain. "Ah, the prodigy graces us with his presence," Richard drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Please, Sam, take a seat. I'm sure we're all dying to hear your next brilliant suggestion." Franklin nodded, ignoring the mocking tone, and sat down. "Thank you. I've been looking over the projections, and I think there are some adjustments we could make to reduce overhead without cutting staff." He opened his notebook, but before he could continue, Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. "Sam, was it? Look, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't a classroom project. We're dealing with real-world problems here." The room erupted in laughter. Franklin swallowed his frustration, trying to remain calm. "I understand that, sir, but no, I don't think you do." Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're here to observe, not to play executive. Leave the decision-making to those of us who actually know what we're doing." Franklin could feel the heat rising to his face, but he forced himself to stay composed. "With all due respect, Mr. Collins, I believe these suggestions could help." Richard slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough!" His voice echoed through the room. "I don't need a lecture from someone who's been here for 2 weeks. If you really want to help, you can start by fetching us some coffee." There were snickers around the table. Franklin's heart pounded in his chest, but he nodded slowly. "Of course. How do you all take it?" The directors looked taken aback for a moment, perhaps expecting him to protest, but Franklin just stared at them calmly. Richard smirked, enjoying the power play. Black. And make it quick. Franklin left the room, feeling a mix of anger and satisfaction. The humiliation was hard to swallow, but he'd gathered valuable information. The blatant disregard for any ideas that didn't come from within their circle was telling. They were so blinded by their arrogance that they couldn't see the impending disaster. As he returned with a tray of coffees, he noticed a flicker of surprise in Richard's eyes. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He placed the coffees on the table, then stood back, waiting. Good boy, Richard sneered, taking his cup. Now, as I was saying, the only way we're going to save this company is by cutting the fat. And by that, I mean hundreds of jobs. It's tough, but necessary. Franklin clenched his jaw. He knew the directors had no intention of considering the human cost of their decisions. To them, employees were numbers on a spreadsheet, easily erased. Any objections, Sam? Richard's voice was laced with mockery. Franklin looked him in the eye and shook his head. None at all, sir. But inside, he was more determined than ever. He would bide his time, play the obedient junior, and watch as they dug themselves deeper into the hole. And when the moment was right, he would expose every lie, every betrayal. They thought he was just a pawn, but they had no idea he was the one holding all the pieces. Franklin arrived early the next morning, mentally preparing for another day of charades. Despite the constant barrage of insults and dismissive behavior, he was determined to remain focused. He had to see this through. As he made his way to his cubicle, he noticed a small group gathered in the break room. Curious, he approached, hearing snippets of their conversation. They're saying the company might not last another quarter, a young woman whispered anxiously. I can't afford to lose this job. Yeah, but what do you expect? Another employee replied. The board is completely out of touch. They're bleeding the company dry. Franklin lingered, taking in their fear and frustration. It was clear that the company's problems ran deeper than poor leadership. There was a pervasive sense of hopelessness among the staff. He felt a pang of guilt knowing that he could end their suffering with just a word. But if he did that, he would miss the opportunity to root out the real problem. As he turned to leave, he almost collided with Jason, who smirked at him. Eavesdropping, Sam? I thought that was beneath you. Just listening, Franklin replied evenly. People have a lot to say if you're willing to hear them out. Jason raised an eyebrow. Well, here's some free advice. Don't get too comfortable. The directors have big plans, and let's just say, it's not looking good for most of us. Franklin feigned ignorance. What do you mean? Jason glanced around, then leaned in conspiratorially. Richard's been talking about outsourcing. They're planning to move a huge chunk of operations overseas. Cheaper labor, fewer regulations. They're going to cut hundreds of jobs here. Probably more. Franklin's mind raced. This was the first he'd heard of the outsourcing plan. He knew they were desperate to cut costs, but this was a drastic measure. One that would devastate the lives of many employees. He needed to get more details, and that meant getting closer to Richard. Thanks for the heads up, Jason, he said, trying to sound casual. Guess I should start looking for other options. Smart move, Jason replied, patting him on the back. You're not as dumb as you look, Sam. Franklin watched him walk away, his smile fading. He needed to find out more about this plan, and fast. Later that day, he spotted Richard heading into the conference room with a few of the directors. Taking a deep breath, Franklin decided to take a risk. He grabbed a stack of papers and followed them, hoping he wouldn't be turned away. He knocked lightly on the door, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. Excuse me, Mr. Collins. I have the reports you requested. Richard looked up, irritation flashing across his face. What reports? Franklin held up the papers. The cost analysis for the downsizing strategy. I thought you'd want to review them before the meeting. Richard's expression shifted, curiosity replacing annoyance. Leave them on the table, and close the door behind you. Yes, sir, Franklin said, stepping inside and setting the papers down. He hesitated for a moment, then added, If there's anything else I can do, please let me know. Richard's eyes narrowed as he studied Franklin. Actually, there is something. We're having a little gathering tonight. Some key stakeholders, a few influential people. I could use someone to help with logistics. Franklin's pulse quickened. This was an unexpected opening. "Of course, sir. I'd be happy to help." Richard gave him a thin smile. "Good. Be at the Hilton at 6. Wear something presentable." "Yes, sir," Franklin replied, backing out of the room. He closed the door behind him, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. He was finally getting somewhere. The rest of the day passed in a blur as he made preparations for the evening. He needed to be careful. Richard was smart, and any misstep could blow his cover. But this was the closest he'd gotten to the inner circle since he arrived. He had to seize the opportunity. When he arrived at the Hilton, Franklin took a moment to steady himself. He had swapped his usual cheap suit for something more appropriate, but still understated. He couldn't afford to draw too much attention. As he entered the ballroom, he saw Richard surrounded by a small group of well-dressed men and women, all laughing and drinking. Franklin stayed on the periphery observing. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense of desperation masked by forced smiles and shallow conversation. These people were all here for one reason: to see if Richard could save the sinking ship. Little did they know, the man they were pinning their hopes on was the same man plotting to abandon them. He watched as Richard moved from group to group, charming and confident. It was a performance, Franklin realized, a carefully crafted facade to hide the cracks beneath. As the night wore on, he noticed Richard discreetly checking his phone, his expression growing more anxious with each glance. Curiosity piqued, Franklin decided to follow him. He waited until Richard slipped out of the room, then quietly trailed him down a corridor. He kept his distance, careful not to be seen. Richard stopped in front of a closed door, glancing around before stepping inside. Franklin approached cautiously, pressing his ear against the door. He could hear Richard's muffled voice, but not the words. Taking a deep breath, he eased the door open a crack and peeked inside. Richard was standing with his back to the door, speaking into his phone. "No, we can't wait any longer. If we don't move those assets by the end of the month, it's over. I've already set up the new accounts. We'll start transferring funds tomorrow." Franklin's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the proof he'd been looking for. Richard was siphoning money from the company, setting up a new venture for himself. He was planning to abandon Ellis and Company and leave everyone else to deal with the fallout. Carefully, Franklin pulled back and closed the door, his mind racing. He needed to act, but he couldn't confront Richard directly, not yet. He needed more evidence, something irrefutable that would expose Richard's betrayal and protect the employees from the fallout. As he walked back to the ballroom, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The game had changed. Richard wasn't just incompetent, he was a traitor, and Franklin would make sure everyone knew the truth. The next morning, Franklin arrived at the office with a newfound sense of urgency. Richard's plan to funnel money out of the company had to be stopped, but he needed to gather concrete evidence first. The stakes were higher now, and every move had to be calculated. He spent the early hours going through financial documents, searching for any trace of the illicit transfers. It was tedious work, but he knew the clues had to be there. Around mid-morning, he was interrupted by an email notification. It was a meeting invitation from Richard for later that afternoon, labeled Urgent Strategy Session. Franklin's heart raced. This could be the moment when Richard would finalize his plans. He needed to be in that room, but he also needed a way to document everything without drawing suspicion. An idea struck him. He had noticed a small and used conference room down the hall from Richard's office. It was typically empty and had a perfect vantage point to overhear conversations from the adjacent room if the door was cracked open just right. He decided he would set up a recording device there before the meeting. It was risky, but he was out of options. He spent the next few hours preparing, discreetly gathering the equipment he needed. He couldn't afford to be caught. It would ruin everything. As the time for the meeting approached, Franklin slipped into the empty conference room, his heart pounding in his ears. He carefully positioned the recording device near the air vent, hoping it would capture the audio from the next room clearly. With everything in place, he hurried to the main conference room for the meeting. Richard and the other directors were already there, their faces tense and serious. Franklin took a seat quietly, trying to blend in as much as possible. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Richard began, his tone grave. "We're in a critical situation, and we need to act fast if we want to salvage anything." He pulled up a series of slides on the projector, outlining the company's dire financial state. Franklin watched as the directors exchanged worried glances. Richard was painting a bleak picture, but Franklin knew it was all part of his manipulation. He was setting the stage to justify his actions. As you can see, Richard continued, our only viable option is to significantly cut costs. That means downsizing and outsourcing most of our operations. He paused, letting the words sink in. I know it's not ideal, but if we want to survive, this is what we have to do. There were murmurs of agreement around the table, but Franklin could see the unease in their eyes. They were being backed into a corner, and Richard was pushing them towards the solution that benefited him the most. Excuse me, Mr. Collins, Franklin spoke up, forcing his voice to remain steady. Have we explored all the alternatives? There are some areas where we could streamline without resorting to such drastic measures. Richard turned to him, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. And what would those be, Sam? Franklin took a deep breath, knowing he had to tread carefully. We could restructure some of the non-essential departments, look into renegotiating supplier contracts, even consider short-term salary adjustments at the executive level. Richard raised an eyebrow, his expression condescending. Salary adjustments? At the executive level? He let out a short, humorless laugh. That's cute, Sam, but you clearly don't understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Franklin clenched his fists under the table, but kept his face neutral. I'm just suggesting we consider all options before making any final decisions. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking at Franklin as if he were an insect under a magnifying glass. You know, Sam, I've been very patient with you. I'll let you speak your mind, offer your little ideas. But this is the real world. And in the real world, we make tough choices. Maybe it's time you stop pretending to be something you're not. Franklin's face burned, but he forced himself to smile. Of course, Mr. Collins. I just want what's best for the company. Richard nodded, clearly satisfied with the response. Good? Then you'll understand that what we're doing is for the greater good. We have to protect the company, no matter what. The meeting continued with the directors discussing the logistics of the outsourcing plan, while Franklin remained silent, absorbing every detail. He knew he would need all of this information later, but for now, he played the role of the obedient junior consultant. After the meeting adjourned, Franklin waited until the office had quieted down. He slipped back into the small conference room and retrieved the recording device. He breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the red light still blinking. The entire conversation had been captured. Back at his apartment, Franklin played back the recording, his hands trembling slightly. As he listened to Richard's smooth, manipulative voice detailing the plan, his resolve hardened. Richard was going to gut the company and leave everyone else to pick up the pieces. But Franklin now had the evidence to expose him. The next day, Franklin made his way to the office with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he had to be strategic. Simply confronting Richard wouldn't be enough. He needed to ensure that everyone knew the truth, that the board and the employees saw Richard for who he really was. He spent the morning reviewing the recording, compiling a detailed report of Richard's actions and the financial evidence he'd gathered over the past weeks. It was all there, the misappropriation of funds, the offshore accounts, and the clear intent to abandon the company. As he finished preparing, an idea struck him. There was a company-wide meeting scheduled for later that afternoon, one that Richard would be leading. It was the perfect opportunity. Franklin knew it was risky, but he also knew it was the only way to get the truth out in the open. When the time came, Franklin made his way to the auditorium. Employees were already filing in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anxiety. He took a seat near the back, watching as Richard and the other directors took the stage. Thank you all for coming, Richard began, his voice confident and reassuring. I know there have been a lot of rumors and concerns about the future of our company. I'm here to address those and to assure you that we have a plan to move forward. Franklin could feel the tension in the room as Richard spoke, weaving his narrative of tough decisions and necessary sacrifices. He waited until Richard paused, glancing around the room with a practiced look of concern. Excuse me, Mr. Collins, Franklin called out, his voice carrying through the auditorium. All eyes turned to him as he stood, holding up the recording device. Richard's face paled as he recognized it. I think everyone here deserves to hear the truth, Franklin continued, his voice steady and clear. The whole truth. The room fell silent as Franklin pressed play, and Richard's voice filled the space, cold and calculating, detailing his plan to strip the company and leave. Franklin watched as shock and anger spread through the crowd, his heart pounding with the thrill of finally revealing the truth. Richard's expression morphed from shock to fury, but before he could say anything, Franklin turned to the employees. "You all deserve to know what's been happening behind closed doors. The people you trusted to lead this company have been planning to abandon it, leaving you all to suffer the consequences." The room erupted in chaos, employees shouting questions and demands. Richard tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Franklin could see the board members whispering among themselves, their faces grim. He knew that they wouldn't be able to ignore this. As security moved in to take control of the situation, Franklin felt a strange sense of calm. He had done what he came here to do. The truth was out, and now it was up to the board and the employees to decide what happened next. Richard was yelling something at him, his face red with anger, but Franklin barely heard him. He was already thinking ahead, planning his next move. He knew this was just the beginning, and he wasn't about to let Richard or anyone else stop him from seeing it through to the end. The aftermath of Franklin's revelation was chaotic. The company was in an uproar, with employees demanding answers and board members scrambling to manage the fallout. Richard was furious, trying desperately to regain control of the narrative. But the damage was done. Franklin had exposed him in front of everyone, and now the entire company knew about the conspiracy. Security had escorted Franklin out of the building after the incident, but not before he'd seen the look of pure rage on Richard's face. It was a small victory, but Franklin knew this was far from over. He spent the evening gathering his thoughts, reaching out to his legal team, and preparing for the inevitable backlash. Richard wasn't going to go down quietly. The next morning, Franklin arrived at the office prepared for a confrontation. He was met by a wall of reporters camped outside the building, cameras flashing as he approached. They shouted questions at him, but he ignored them, pushing his way through the crowd. His focus was on the people inside, those who mattered. As he stepped into the lobby, the atmosphere was tense. Employees were gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices, their faces a mix of fear and uncertainty. He could feel their eyes on him as he made his way to the elevators, but he kept his head high. He wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else intimidate him. He was barely out of the elevator when he was confronted by Jason, the senior analyst who had previously mocked him. Jason's face was flushed with anger and confusion. "Sam, no, Franklin," he sputtered, blocking Franklin's path. "What the hell was that yesterday? Are you insane? Do you know what you've done?" Franklin looked at him calmly. "I did what needed to be done, Jason. This company deserves better than to be gutted by a greedy few." Jason shook his head, disbelief etched across his features. "You don't get it. Richard's not going to let this slide. You've put yourself in serious danger." "Maybe," Franklin replied, his voice steady. "But I'm not the one who's been stealing from the company and planning to leave everyone else high and dry." Before Jason could respond, the elevator doors opened again, and Richard stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards. His eyes locked onto Franklin, burning with hatred. "Mr. Lewis," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I think it's time we had a little chat." The security guards moved to flank Franklin, but he didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Lead the way, Mr. Collins." They escorted him to a conference room on the top floor, where the rest of the board was already gathered. The atmosphere was charged, the directors looking tense and uncomfortable. Franklin took a seat at the end of the table, across from Richard, who remained standing, his hands gripping the back of a chair, so tightly his knuckles were white. "You've caused quite a mess, Mr. Lewis," Richard began, his voice strained but controlled. "And now, you're going to explain yourself." Franklin met his gaze without blinking. "There's nothing to explain. I exposed what you were doing because it was wrong. You were planning to abandon this company, leave these people with nothing. They deserve to know the truth." Richard's lips curled into a sneer. "And you think you're some kind of hero, swooping in to save the day? You're a fool, Lewis. You have no idea what you're up against." "I'm not afraid of you, Richard," Franklin said evenly. "And I'm not alone in this." Richard laughed, but it was a hollow sound devoid of humor. "Is that so?" You think you've won just because you expose a few details? This isn't over, not by a long shot. Franklin leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. You're right, it's not over. But it's not going to end the way you think. You've underestimated the people here, and you've underestimated me. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. One of the board members, a woman named Ellen who had been quietly observing the exchange, cleared her throat. Richard, I think we need to take a step back and evaluate the situation, she said, her voice measured. Clearly, there are some serious allegations here that need to be addressed. Richard shot her a glare, but she held her ground. Franklin could see the cracks forming in Richard's control. The board wasn't completely in his pocket, not anymore. He decided to push further. I have the evidence, Franklin said, looking around the table at the other directors. Everything you need to see what Richard has been doing. The offshore accounts, the diverted funds, the fake contracts. It's all there. There were murmurs among the board members, and Richard's face turned a deep shade of red. This is a witch hunt, he snapped. You're just trying to undermine me, because you couldn't handle being rejected. Franklin stood, meeting Richard's furious gaze head-on. This isn't about me. It's about saving this company from you. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched, but before he could say anything, the door burst open and a group of employees streamed in, led by Jason. They looked determined, and Franklin felt a surge of hope. Mr. Collins, Jason began, his voice loud and clear. We've seen the evidence. We know what you've been doing. You're not going to get away with this. Richard's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. You can't be serious. This is all lies, fabricated by this man. He pointed a shaking finger at Franklin, but the employees didn't back down. More were filing into the room now, their expressions a mix of anger and resolve. They had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let Richard dismiss them. Ellen stood, raising her hands for silence. Everyone, please calm down. We need to handle this properly. Richard rounded on her, his voice frantic. Are you really going to take a side, Ellen? After everything I've done for this company? Ellen's eyes were cold as she looked at him. You mean everything you've done for yourself, Richard? You've betrayed all of us. The room erupted into chaos, everyone talking at once. Franklin watched as Richard's control slipped away, his face twisted with rage and desperation. It was over, and Richard knew it. Enough! Franklin shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. This isn't about revenge. It's about the future of this company. We need to move forward, but we can't do that with Richard at the helm. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding, others looking uncertain. Ellen stepped forward, her voice firm. We'll need to convene an emergency meeting to vote on Richard's position. Until then, Richard, I suggest you leave the premises. Richard looked around, wild-eyed, as if searching for someone to back him up. But the room was silent, the employees staring at him with expressions of disgust and betrayal. He turned back to Franklin, his eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over, Lewis, he spat. You'll regret this. Franklin held his gaze. Maybe, but at least I can live with myself. With one last look of fury, Richard stormed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Franklin turned to Ellen and the other board members. Now we can start rebuilding. We have a lot of work to do. Ellen nodded, her expression resolute. We do, but I think we're finally on the right track. As the employees began to disperse, Franklin felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot. There were still battles to be fought, and Richard would no doubt try to make good on his threats. But for now, the company had a fighting chance, and that was more than they'd had before. He stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. There was hope now, a chance for real change. And for the first time since he'd walked into Ellis & Company, Franklin felt like he was truly making a difference. The weeks that followed Richard's ousting were a whirlwind of change and recovery. The company was in disarray, but Franklin, now fully recognized as the majority shareholder and interim CEO, took swift action to stabilize the situation. The board had voted unanimously to remove Richard from his position, and he had left the company amidst a flurry of media scrutiny and legal investigations. With Richard gone, Franklin knew that this was only the beginning of the real work. The damage he had caused was extensive, and it would take more than just good intentions to rebuild the trust and stability of the organization. The first step was addressing the employees. He organized a company-wide meeting in the same auditorium where he had exposed Richard. The atmosphere was different this time, still tense, but with a sense of cautious hope. As Franklin stepped up to the podium, he saw hundreds of faces looking back at him, the same people who had been ignored and dismissed by the previous leadership. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice calm and steady. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult, and I won't pretend that everything will be fixed overnight. But I want to assure you that my priority is to rebuild this company, not just as a business, but as a community." There were nods and murmurs of agreement. Franklin continued, "We're going to make some changes, starting with a complete audit of our finances. Every dollar will be accounted for, and every questionable transaction will be investigated. We need to know exactly where we stand before we can move forward." He paused, looking around the room. "I also want to hear from you. Your ideas, your concerns, your frustrations. For too long, your voices have been ignored. That ends now. This company belongs to all of us, and it's time we start acting like it." The crowd erupted into applause, the first sign of real support he had seen. It was a small victory, but an important one. Over the next few days, Franklin set up open forums where employees could speak directly to him and other members of the board. He listened as they shared their grievances, their hopes, and their ideas for the future. One of the most poignant moments came from a young engineer named Maria, who had been with the company for nearly a decade. She spoke with tears in her eyes about how she had felt invisible under Richard's regime, her ideas dismissed simply because she didn't fit into the old boys club. Franklin thanked her for her courage and promised that things would be different. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and he was determined to prove that this wasn't just lip service. He started by implementing a new policy of transparency. All major decisions, financial or otherwise, would be communicated openly with the employees. He established an internal council made up of representatives from every department, giving employees a direct line to the leadership. It was a radical shift from the top-down structure that had ruled the company before. But there were still the financial repercussions of Richard's mismanagement to deal with. Franklin's team worked around the clock, poring over the books, finding the hidden accounts, and tracing the missing funds. They managed to recover a significant portion, but it wasn't enough to save everyone's job. Hard decisions had to be made, but Franklin was determined to do it with compassion and fairness. He held meetings with the affected departments, explaining the situation openly. Severance packages were offered, and he made sure that those who had to leave were given support to transition to new opportunities. It was painful, but it was necessary. And through it all, Franklin was there listening, explaining, and doing everything he could to minimize the impact. One afternoon, as he was going through a stack of reports in his office, Ellen knocked on the door and stepped inside. "You're doing well, Franklin," she said, her tone genuine. "Better than I think any of us expected, including me." Franklin looked up, surprised. "Thank you, Ellen, but we still have a long way to go." She nodded, sitting down across from him. "Yes, but you've already done more than most people would. You didn't have to do this, you know. You could have just walked away, let the company collapse, and moved on." Franklin sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I couldn't do that. These people deserve better. And besides, I had to see this through." Ellen smiled. "And you have. The board wants to offer you the position permanently, if you're willing to take it." He was taken aback. "Permanently?" "Yes. You've proven yourself. We believe you're the right person to lead this company into the future." Franklin was silent for a moment, considering. He had come here with one purpose: to expose the corruption and save the company. But over the past weeks, he had found himself becoming more invested in the people here, in the community they were building together. "I'll need some time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Ellen replied. "But whatever you decide, know that you've made a difference." That's something not many people can say. After she left, Franklin sat in his office, staring out the window. He thought about everything that had happened, about the people he had met and the battles they had fought together. He had achieved what he set out to do, but he realized now that this was just the beginning. The next day, he called another meeting with the board. As they gathered in the conference room, he felt a sense of calm and clarity. When everyone was seated, he stood up, taking a deep breath. "I've thought a lot about your offer," he began, looking around the table. "And I'm honored that you have so much faith in me. But if I'm going to do this, we need to do it right. We need to rebuild this company, not just financially, but culturally." He outlined his vision for the future, a company built on transparency, respect, and innovation. A place where every employee felt valued and heard. It was ambitious, but he could see the nods of agreement around the table. They were ready for this change, and so was he. "I accept the position," Franklin said finally, "but only if we're all committed to making this company something we can be proud of." The board members looked at each other, then back at him. Ellen was the first to speak. "We're with you, Franklin. All the way." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few months, Franklin and his team implemented the changes they had discussed. There were setbacks and challenges, but they persevered. Slowly, the company began to turn around, both financially and culturally. Employees were more engaged, more motivated. The atmosphere was one of hope and possibility. One evening, as Franklin walked through the office, he passed by a group of employees working late. They were laughing and talking, the energy in the room vibrant and alive. It was a stark contrast to the grim, oppressive environment he had walked into all those months ago. He smiled, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment he hadn't felt in a long time. He had come here to save a company, but he had found something much more valuable. A community, a purpose, and a chance to make a real difference. As he stepped outside, the city lights glowing around him, Franklin felt a sense of peace. There was still work to be done, but for the first time, he knew they were on the right path. And he was exactly where he needed to be. The company's recovery became a success story, a testament to the power of integrity and leadership. Franklin was hailed as a hero, but he always made it clear that it was a team effort, that the real heroes were the people who had believed in him, who had fought alongside him. And as the company flourished, Franklin knew that this was just the beginning. They were building something that would last, something that would inspire others. And for that, he was grateful. He had come to expose the truth, but in the end, he had found something much more important, a place where he truly belonged. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.